To open a book is to open the mind, and I open my mind to things that are kind, like forests and trees and rivers that run, and people and places and things that are fun. I travel the world wherever I go, and if I open a book, I'll get there, I know. Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Kimberly Johnson, and what you just heard was a poem that I wrote called To Open a Book. And inside that poem, I literally talk about how powerful and wonderful it is to open a book and get all kinds of great ideas and feelings and thoughts that you can share with others, and how powerful and great that can be. But when I sat down and wrote my first nonfiction book, No Fear for Freedom, the story of the Friendship Nine, some of those ideas and values in that poem went away. Because I tell you, I'm going to be very transparent with you in this little segment. I was struggling because some of these things in the story that I had to write about, particularly during the civil rights movement, had me going through a gamut of emotions. I felt mad, I felt sad, I felt excited, I felt confused, I felt fearful, I felt hopeful. And so I'm going to give you a little insight of the journey that I had when I wrote this powerful book, No Fear for Freedom, the story of the Friendship Nine. First, let me give you a little bit of background. You see, in 1961, the civil rights movement had grown stagnant. They were protesting and picketing and also boycotting, but it still did not get the results that the civil rights movement needed. And the civil rights movement, particularly under the guise of Dr. Martin Luther King and other great iconic figures, had to be a nonviolent effort. So the Friendship Nine were a group of gentlemen who in 1961 were essentially 17 and 18-year-old college students. They were hanging out with their friends and having a great time and trying to understand what this whole civil rights movement meant and why equity was such a hard thing to come by. But they decided that they wanted to do something to become change agents in the community. So with great organizations leading the way like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, they decided to help with a premise called Jail, No Bail. And what made this premise so powerful was that instead of paying the $100 bail to get out of prison, they decided to stay in jail. And that staying in jail meant that they could shake up the civil rights movement. So instead of putting the burden of the oppressed onto the community and having them pay the $100 bail, they shifted the burden of the oppressed to the oppressors. So now the people who were creating these injustices had to feed, house, and clothe and give medical treatment to these men who were in prison for trying to find equity. So the civil rights movement needed the Friendship Nine. The Friendship Nine needed the civil rights movement. So together, collaboratively, they shook up the movement in positive and powerful ways. Now, when I was doing this research, I had to really dig into the history of the civil rights movement. But even in the civil rights movement, I had to go even further back and start looking at the years from 1619 up to the civil rights movement. And in that sits a lot of sadness and anger and hate that I could not even imagine. Because remember, I'm a children's author. I write about butterflies, bunnies, and frogs. That's where I sit. But I have to tell you, when I started uncovering and reviewing that history, I was struggling. Because I didn't want to walk away from this story hating. I didn't want to hate people. I didn't want to hate the situations. I didn't want to hate scenarios. But the truth of the matter is that when you are digging and you are writing about things that are truth, you are going to unearth some things that really make you sick. And I can't think of another way to say it. Things that make you sick. How human beings can treat each other the way they actually treated each other. And I say treat because now we're starting to see ourselves come into some things now that are really terrible flashbacks for many of the people who had to go through the civil rights movement and many of the people who are facing these injustices and inequities. But the thing that I kept holding on to was that hopefulness that when we get to the other side, that we can find that greatness that we can get back to and talk about young people embracing each other and loving each other and caring about who we are as a people, as a community, and as a world. And so I hold on to that hopefulness. But as a children's author, I had to tell truths, and these truths were not pretty. They weren't those fun stories that I'm talking about. I had to tell stories about how these men walked into a lunch counter to order something to eat, to get something to drink, and they were dragged out the back door. I had to tell stories about how these men were spit on, how trash was thrown at them, how they were given really unjust things to do while they were thrown into these prisons, and how they still had love in their heart. That was that hopefulness part. That was that piece that kept me writing the story and telling these truths. And we have to know that as a community, as a world, we have to let our children know where they come from. We have to let our children know the history that they sit on, but it has to be equitable history. It has to be all of the truth. We can't tell just the pieces that sound good and the pieces that feel good, but we have to tell the ugly parts too, because that's how young people learn to make decisions about what they will do and if they will become the true change agents that we know they can be. I had to uncover a lot of my own dark feelings in this book. Part of me is sad that I had to do that, but part of me is relieved. Part of me is excited that I had to, because I needed to understand why I felt the way I felt about certain things. I needed to know that the world is still a good place. In 2015, after 54 years, these men were taken back into the courtroom and their records were cleared as if nothing had ever happened. So you see, in 1961, they were charged as trespassers, as criminals, and sent to prison. But in 2015, they walked through that door as free men on the records. And you know, they were always free men. When I interviewed them, I saw them as courageous human beings who did something for freedom that I don't know, and I can honestly sit here and say that I would have done. I don't know if I would have done that. I would like to think that I would have, but in 61, it was such a volatile time, but they walked in with peace. They walked in with the idea of justice. They walked in with the idea of equity in mind. And because of that, they shifted the world. And I think we can learn so much from them right now, because the truth is we're living in volatile times. I can't sit here as an author and say that it's not true. We're living in volatile times. But if somehow we can take these messages from these civil rights icons, whether they were as great and grand as Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, and all of the great iconic figures, or if they're as plain and everyday as the City Girls or the Friendship Nine or the Greensboro gentlemen, the Greensboro Four that sat in, we can learn something from them, and that can give us hope and belief that we can change the world. Even in the middle of the craziness that we're facing right now, we can shift the world, but we've got to be able to be transparent. We've got to be willing to peel back those layers to face some of the demons that we have to face in our own lives, and look for the glory and the goodness and the greatness that sits inside of every single one of us. But we have to be willing to pull back the layers, because in that truth, we find not only what we can give our young people, but we find what we can give back to the world. This was the hardest book I've ever written. I don't know if I'll write another nonfiction. I would like to think that I would, because I like to see and hear the stories that are out there, the truths that are out there. But I tell you, this book made me have to face things that I don't know if I want to face again. We're moving towards that in the world right now, and I think I'm a little bit prepared because of this journey, but I'm still nowhere near prepared to face any of the ugliness and the horrors that could come if we don't shift the world where we are right now. So I challenge you to take a look at these iconic figures, the ones who believed in nonviolence, the ones who wanted to see equity, the ones who knew what justice looked like, and take their playbook and figure out how we can take nuggets from everything they taught us, because they gave us the roadmap of how to find some justice. Yes, the world is still tough, and yes, there are still systemic things that we've got to change, but the truth of the matter is they gave us the playbook. And we've got to take that playbook and we've got to figure out how we collectively, it doesn't matter what color you are, what religion, what gender, what background, any of that stuff. It doesn't matter. But people coming together who love each other and who want to see a change in the world. We've got the ability to do that right now. But we've got to have no fear for freedom. So I hope that you gathered a piece of my heart from what this book meant to me and why it was important, and how we can take what we've learned and what we are learning and shift the world. That's how we make a difference. That's how we change the world. I'm Dr. Kimberly Johnson. Thank you.